Did you know that you had to withdraw when you showed up this morning?
So Nick was sat towards the back of the room, but he looked rather calm. He stayed seated for the majority of the time, did stand up to speak with Alan as he was introducing him to the new defense attorney, Kimberly Green. He looked pretty pleased. He was very calm and stoic.
Could this news about Nick Reiner's conservatorship be a game changer?
Honestly, it might.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Now, just have a look at these headlines, all pretty much saying the same thing. Rolling Stone. Nick Reiner was in a year-long mental health conservatorship in 2020. Report. People. Nick Reiner was placed under mental health conservatorship 5 years before parents' killing. Report. The Independent. Nick Reiner had been in mental health conservatorship in 2020, years before he allegedly killed his parents. Report. TMZ. Nick Reiner landed in mental health conservatorship in 2020. Now, according to the New York Times, Nick Reiner, who had been charged with the murder of his parents, Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, was placed into a year-long mental health conservatorship in 2020, according to two people with knowledge of the legal arrangement. That's really important to stress. A conservatorship is a legal arrangement. A clerk with the Los Angeles Superior Court said the conservatorship ended in 2021. That's really important. Let's put those words on screen. The conservatorship ended in 2021. Now, back to the New York Times. Stephen Bauer, a licensed fiduciary, was appointed. He was the conservator for Nick Reiner, not his parents, right? Stephen Bauer. And he said that mental illness is an epidemic that is widely misunderstood, and this is a horrible tragedy. Both people declined to provide further details about the arrangement, citing confidentiality. The revelation of the conservatorship underscores the severity of the mental health challenges Nick Reiner faced in recent years, issues that are likely to be central to his legal defense. Indeed. Now, you may remember I mentioned in a previous video how often in true crime we can find answers, contextual and otherwise, in the timeline.
Time's up.
Time. The answer is time.
And time is relevant when we deal with the conservatorship as well. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. If you don't know who I am and you're not sure whether you want to subscribe, have a quick look at my 10-second bio. I've got a background in law. I've written a bunch of books and I've attended trials around the world, including in America. I've also written 3 books on the OJ Simpson case, Juice, Juice 2, Juice 3. If you're interested in that, I'll put a link to those books in the description. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button. Every little bit counts, and let's get started. Do you agree it would be more significant if Nick was under conservatorship at the time the crime was committed? That would be central to his defense case if that were the case. But a conservatorship scenario fluctuates in tune with the machinations of mental illness. The fact is, Nick was placed under conservatorship for 1 year, and that was 5 years ago. Now, the interesting thing that potentially arises out of this is this idea that in the last months of last year, 2025, September, October, November, December, Nick seemed to be sort of going downhill. He seemed to be on a kind of a downward spiral. Do you agree? We can see it on his face. We also know that his medication changed, and we know that he gained weight. And we know the sort of end game, what happened at the very end of that process. Disaster. I can't help wondering, though, whether the conservatorship scenario didn't come up again. Because surely if his mental health was deteriorating, especially if it was deteriorating seriously, serious enough to bring it up as his defense, surely during that period, if that was going on, is folks might not have been thinking about another stint in rehab. They would have been thinking about something more appropriate, something stricter, something more in tune with what was going on with his evolving and fluctuating mental health. Now think about it. That had started when Nick was 14 or 15 years old. I'm talking about those stints in rehab. He was 14 or 15 when he did his first stint in rehab, and then that went on for 4 or 5 years up until he was 19 years old. And that all of that was more than 10 years ago. The joke, of course, is that Nick's movie, Being Charlie, came out in May 2016. And 4 years later, Nick, who comes across in interviews during that period promoting that movie, he comes across as cocksure and as though he's sort of clean and as though he's able to handle himself. Well, 4 years later, in other words, 4 years after Being Charlie came out, again, we looking at the answers in the timeline. Well, it was back to the drawing board. Nick had backslidden to the point where he was in a more serious situation, arguably, than rehab. And have a look at this. A conservatorship is widely considered a more severe and profound loss of rights than undergoing rehabilitation, in other words, rehab. Rehab is a form of treatment, while a conservatorship, this is really important, is a legal process that strips an individual of their basic civil liberties and autonomy. It's a kind of prison sentence until your mental health basically returns to the level that it needs to. And that is something that also can happen. You can be rehabilitated during a conservatorship. You can regain your mental health. So in a sense, a conservatorship, can you see, is worse than rehab. It lasts longer. It can involve actually locking up a patient, and the patient is sort of deprived of their rights for the duration. And so let me ask you a question. If you were in Nick's position, or if you were basically a drug addict, and someone offered you the choice between rehab and a conservatorship, what do you think would be the easier sentence, the easier process essentially to go through? Because, as I say, the patient is like deprived of their rights for the duration. But here is the critical insight. And again, you see, we are looking for the answers in terms of time. How long does a conservatorship last? Well, a conservatorship lasts 1 year. And then about 3 months before it expires, 90 days, the clerk of the probate court will mail you, the conservator, a notice of expiration. The notice will say the date that the conservatorship ends. The conservatee also gets a notice from the court. And then if you need to, you can petition to renew the conservatorship. Otherwise, it will end. This means the conservatee, Nick Reiner in this case, would then be free to make his or her own decisions, and including to refuse treatment. And so what you can see here is there's a period where a person's legal position, legal stature diminishes, but then after a certain period of time, they regain all of their rights once more, right? And the fact is Nick's conservatorship was not renewed since 2020, essentially 2021, which suggests that he'd regained his mental health not just for a few months, but for several years. It may well be that medical opinion will have the final word on Nick Reiner's culpability if this case goes to trial. And if this case goes to trial, and when this case goes to trial, will, I think, be contingent on a competency evaluation. I still think that that is something that is in Nick's future. Now, there will be broad medical opinion on his mental health, but I find it difficult to imagine if he wasn't under conservatorship at the time that these murders took place, and if on that day that the murders took place, his parents invited him to a party and along to premieres in the month before, well, doesn't it seem that they thought his condition wasn't that serious? If it was that serious, he would have been in a conservatorship. Also, did Nick think his condition was that serious? And so I think you're going to need to balance that. Does Nick say that his condition right now is extremely serious and he should be under conservatorship? Okay, well, what about then? Why not then? What was his position on his mental health then? And I suppose you could make the argument that the Reiners made this mistake Rob and Michelle made this mistake, that he should have been under conservatorship, but they made the mistake of being too lenient on Nick because there were signs were there and they ignored them. But to me, it comes back to the original legal question. You are not guilty by reason of insanity if you can't tell the difference between right and wrong. So where is the murder weapon in this case? Why did Nick seem to go on the run, and how was he able to check into a hotel, get to the hotel, buy himself sustenance several times, if he was so insane, such a basket case that he couldn't take care of himself? The other aspect that will likely become a battle of the experts will probably deal with whether and how much chemicals may have essentially hijacked Nick's brain. Now, whether you want to say the change of medication or whether he was back taking drugs at the time or both, a change of medication and taking drugs, whether you want to argue that these chemicals induced a kind of temporary psychosis and you should put the commission of the crime at the door of these chemicals, or whether these chemicals aggravated an underlying psychosis, I still think it comes back to an argument against criminal psychology. Have a look at this. Psychosis is a state where a person loses touch with reality, experiencing symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, which leads to disorganized thinking, speech and behavior, often signaled by social withdrawal or performance drops. Now, if your thinking is so disorganized that you have psychosis, think about how organized Nick's thinking was in the aftermath. We don't know where the murder weapon is. Nick checks himself into a hotel. Nick is able to feed himself. Is it really so disorganized? And no matter how dysfunctional, psychotic, or drug-addled the perpetrator, the bottom line is whether they could tell right from wrong. And I think the fact that the prosecution are continuing to prosecute this case, they have all the information. I think one can take, in a sense, our cue from them. Did they do drug tests on Nick? Did they check his blood? And what were the results from that? I think that's going to be very revealing. What medications, what chemicals were in his system? Remember, Nick, in his own words during his press tour, admitted trashing his guest house. He admitted that wasn't a nice thing to do. In other words, in that particular case, he knew right from wrong, didn't he? So why did he trash the guest house? Well, because his parents told him, because he was using drugs again, that he needed to leave the guest house. Why? Because of his drug use, they were going to kick him out, and he became upset. And so it was out of pique, it was out of a rational understanding that they were going to kick him out, that he got upset. Well, didn't that happen on the night of the murders as well? And can you argue he then acted out of insanity, or was that a kind of a sane overreaction, an emotional reaction to this particular issue coming up again? We don't know, but could it have come up again? And if so, wasn't his decision-making essentially a choice between drugs and their lives? And probably people close to the family, Jake and Romy and perhaps uncles and aunts and friends, might be aware of what the Reiners were thinking privately about what to do about Nick. And that probably may have been communicated, including discussions with Nick's doctors and with people related to that. And so if they stood between him and his drugs on that night, what was he going to choose? Was he going to choose the drugs, or was he going to choose to go with them? Well, what had he chosen in the past? Also, and my guess is if they stood between him and his drugs, wasn't he going to choose the drugs? If so, can such a decision be rationalized not as a drug addict committing murder to feed their habit, but that we must be sympathetic that poor Nick was simply so disturbed that he didn't know what he was doing and that he should be let off the hook? I mean, are we sure about that? What do you think? Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.